1 Kings 19 and verse 1, if you want to follow along. And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had executed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not take your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow at this time." And when he saw that, he rose and ran for his life. He went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and he left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. And he came down under a broom tree, and he prayed that he might die, and said, "It is enough now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my father's." And as he lay and slept underneath a broom tree, what's a broom tree, by the way? Suddenly an angel touched him and said, "Arise and eat." And he looked, and there by his head was a cake baked on coals and a jar of water. And so he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, because the journey is great for you." So he arose, ate, and drank, and he went on the strength of that food for 40 days and 40 nights as far as Horeb, the mountain of the Lord. And he went to a cave, and he spent the night in that place, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he said, "I have been zealous for the Lord of God of hosts, for the children of Israel, and have forsaken your covenant, who have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." And then he said, "Go out and stand before the mountain." He said, God said, "And stand on the mountain before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, as a great and strong wind tore into the mountains and broke the rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake was fire. The Lord was not in the fire. Elijah was confused, overwhelmed, and lost. There was a whirlwind around him. There was an earthquake shaking his foundation. There was a fire. These are mighty and massive things on their own, are they not? The wind was swirling, the earth was shaking, but Elijah couldn't see. Elijah had just done great things. I mean, you know the story just before this, right? But now he cowered, confused, and alone. As in the opening prayer just a few minutes ago, the world is now full of that uncertainty, is it not? It's a confusion that kind of consists around the world. I mean, talking to Chris Henderson last week, it's just weird nowadays, right? Everything is just weird. Everything is what's going on, right? There's inflation, corruption, there's stupidity and incompetence at every level of society. And we respond with they, them, it's their fault. There's fear-mongering, right? Whatever that term actually means. But how do we respond to the confusion that surrounds us? Not in a spirit of fear, but of truth. So what is fear? Let's go beyond fear if we can. Fear is yareh, it's Strong's 3372. To fear, be afraid. To stand in awe of or awed, have respect, be dreadful, feared, cause astonishment and awe. To make afraid and terrify. What you don't know, what you fear, is what you don't understand. Is it not? Does your lack of understanding lead to that fear? The fear of the unknown, the fear of the dread, the dreadful. You may have reverence for that because it's imposing, is it not? What's going on in this world? Yeah, you got to have a little respect for it. But that's a little different too. Maybe we fill ourselves with knowledge. We don't understand what's going on. Let's go back to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We fill ourselves with knowledge and hope of putting our fears to rest. If we know more, we have pride in our knowledge. Maybe we know that evil. Well, there's some benefit in our world to knowing that evil, that we may face it. But not that we can have the knowledge to defeat these things ourselves, right? Doesn't matter how hard you study sometimes. Doesn't matter how hard you look for the answer. Think of Israel before the Red Sea, right? They had just witnessed some of the most massive things, the 10 plagues, right? Before that, and now they're before the Red Sea with a mountain on one side and a mountain on the other side, drowning death in front of them, so they thought, and Pharaoh behind them. They were confused. There was a lot going on in their world. Or Israel. They were told shortly thereafter to go into the promised land. But where can we go up, they say in Deuteronomy 1 and verse 28. Our brethren have discouraged our hearts, saying, the people are greater and taller than we are. The cities are great and fortified up to the heaven. Moreover, we have seen the sons of Anakim there. And God said, and Moses said to them, do not be terrified or afraid of them. The Lord your God who goes before you, he will fight for you, as he did in Egypt. So that fear leads to confusion. Something that we don't know, that we fear, is that lack of the understanding that creates that fear in us. It pulls against the opposite of fear. It's hope, right? It pulls against the hope and the peace that we seek in our lives. It's something that we don't know. It causes anxiety. Been there? Makes our head spin. Have you been there? Makes us wander and worry, and we become lost. We feel we have to do something. We have to respond. But what do we respond with? We get confused. Even thinking about that sometimes. I sense much fear in you, as the phrase goes. This world, this life, is confusing and filled with turmoil. But are we afraid? What is this confusion? What is this confusion in the world? 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 33. You know this one. For God is not of confusion, but of peace, right? He is not of confusion. If we apply this to our lives should be ordered, peaceful, not confused, right? That's what we should be. So the word confusion there is interesting. If we kind of go into that word a little bit, akastasia. It's Greek 181. It's instability, disorder, commotion, tumult. For God is not he's not of commotion. He's not of tumult, but of peace, is he not? Luke 21 and verse 7 uses this verse as well. And so they asked him, this is the disciples talking to Jesus, Teacher, when will these things be, and what will there be when these things are about to take place? And he said, Take heed that you be not deceived, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he. The time has drawn near. Therefore do not go after them. But when you hear of the wars and commotions, akastasia, war and confusion, do not be terrified, for these things must first come to pass. Wars and confusion. Confusion is also translated as the word songkuchis, which is commixture. It's a mixturing, a disturbance, and confusion as well. It's the other Greek word that's used for confusion. So a mixing, a confusion, a tumult, a turmoil, right? The Old Testament has five different words, actually, that are translated as confusion. If you want to go to the Hebrew, tebel is one of the Hebrew words. It means, actually, it's a confusion, but that word actually means like an unnatural bestiality. So, confusion. Bosheth is the other word. It's ashamed or in confusion. Kaoloni is the other word. It's confusion as a sense of dishonor, ignominy, reproach, and shame. Kauferi is to be ashamed or be confounded. And there are dozens and dozens of scriptures for these. The other one that we know this one really, really well is tohu. Right? Tohu ebuhu. Genesis 1 and verse 2. And the earth was without form and void, and the darkness was in the face of the earth, and the Spirit moved upon the face of the water. Right? There was confusion in the creation at that time. Confusion is ultimately the way of Satan, is it not? It's dishonor, shame, emptiness, waste, vanity. It's the opposite of bringing things together, opposite of fusion, confusion, right? It's men becoming more separate. It's randomness and disorder without focus. Our lives may feel that way, don't they, occasionally? We have our struggles. We have our lack of focus. We may get hit by those struggles, and they may overwhelm us. So how do we counter this confusion? Go to the basics. Matthew 6, verse 8. Therefore, do not be like them, for your Father knows the things you have need of before you ask him. There's a pattern there. In this manner, therefore, pray. Our God in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Your will be done as thelema, T-H-E-L-E-M-A, thelema. Desire, pleasure, and will. It's translated 62 times as will. What one wishes or has determined to be done. The purpose of God to bless mankind, his will for mankind. And what God wishes to be done, his commands, his precepts, his will, choice, inclination, desire, pleasure for you, for this world. Romans 12 and verse 2 also uses this term. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is good and acceptable and the perfect will of God. Your mind should not be conformed to the confusion of this world, right? It shouldn't be reformed to this randomness, this disarray, this separation of this world, but what is good and acceptable as the will of God. 1 John 2 and verse 17. And the world is passing away in the lust of it, but he who does the will of God abides forever. So now we have a concept coming in here with the will of God, this element of hope. Past the virtual pleasures and lusts of this world, beyond what you and I can see, but to the forever, the eternal, right? There's an element of the promise that he has for us in there, right? The will of God. Hebrews 10 and verse 36 uses this phrase as well. For you have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise, right? The will of God is directly linked to that hope in the future, that promise that we have. Seek the will of God. The will of God, and to me, I've always thought of this as like a path that we're on, right? It's this journey that we're supposed to be walking. Our eyes may be closed, but we have to keep walking. I don't know if you've ever done that when you're out in the woods. You're going to trip, right? Maybe you're on a sidewalk. Or there's a scene in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. I assume we're all seen this, so there's no spoilers here. But, right, he's going through the trials to find the Holy Grail at the end, but he has to cross this chasm. And he has to take a step out across this vast chasm, if you remember that scene in the story. He had to put his foot out and step into nothing, what appeared to be nothing, but it was an illusion, and that's how it worked for the movie. If you remember that, I see heads nodding. Thank you. Okay, it's interactive for this part. It's okay. So, right? So we get that. But have you ever felt like that? It's a poignant scene, right? You just got to put your foot out, close your eyes, and lean forward. Walking forward, stepping out, not really understanding where you're going, not understanding that there's actually a path in front of you that you can't see yet. You're going to have to travel somewhere. You're going to have to do something. Maybe that path is going to go up. Maybe it's going to go down. Maybe it's going to left, or maybe it's going to go right. Proverbs 3 and verse 5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. A little different now in that context a little bit. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. All those concepts we've just been talking about, they're right there. We can't expect to know our own path. We can't necessarily see our own path before us, but it's there. We may feel the dirt between our toes, right? That feeling. You may feel the smoothness of the asphalt before you. It's easy going. You may stub your toes in the gravel. You may get mud between your toes and it grinds in there. And at times, you may feel like you're sliding on ice, right? Now, maybe that ice is there for a reason. Maybe God put it there because he's sliding you forward, making you move when you don't necessarily want to move. He's kind of tilting it, and you're like, phew. Maybe that reason we're sliding is because we're not rooted into God. We're not rooted into his path. So we're just on that slippery slope. There are many plans in a man's heart, nevertheless the Lord's counsel that will stand. Proverbs 19, verse 21. No matter our plans, God's counsel will happen. It will stand. Jeremiah 10 and verse 23, I know the way of a man is not in himself, not in a man to direct his own steps. Luke 22, verse 42. Father, if it is your will, take this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, your will be done. Yeshua himself experienced this. Not my will, your will be done. So that's okay to feel that, right? Christ did. See that you walk circumspectly in Ephesians 5 and verse 15, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. So how do we do this? How do we find the will of God? How do we walk in the path of his counsel? Be not unwise, right? How do we do that? There's an interesting parallel in the work and out there. If you go to science, if you're a scientist and you kind of dig into these things, or an academic and you want to kind of go through this, there's a gentleman, Edward Lorenz, in 1961. He was a meteorologist at MIT who was programming weather models. And he was trying to follow kind of Newton's physics and laws of physics there, trying to figure out how to repeat and predict the future. And one day, when he was calculating these models and this weather future, he rounded a figure 0.506127. He rounded it to 0.506. So it's within 1/10,000th of a decimal point, right? So the nearest 1/10,000th. That's good enough. It's pretty small. And he assumed this rounding wouldn't make a difference. Just round off a little bit, cut off the end. But it did in his models. He made that one change, and it multiplied through the variables of his modeling, and it changed, even if he changed and adjusted later variables, it never came back to the path. This is the kind of the early beginnings of meteorological weather forecasting. But he discovered something called deterministic chaos. It's formulated systems where a few variables in these highly complicated systems help understand the unpredictable. And using a digital computer back then, he was able to kind of do this at one level. But he's ultimately describing, maybe you've heard of the butterfly effect, right? Butterfly effect. This is essentially chaos theory. If a butterfly is flapping its wings, let's say in Singapore, that can cause a hurricane in the Caribbean. It's a little adjustments in the weather and the wind leads to that. It's dependent upon the initial state of that original circumstance, and something small or a small change in the very beginning can lead and to expand into bigger unknown things that can't be predicted much later on. So think about that. Why do small changes in one little variable seem to have profound effects, yet other large changes that we see in the world seem to have no effect? Kind of intuitively makes some sense. To us, what happens after that butterfly flaps its wings, we'll say, it looks like chaos, doesn't it? It looks confusing. But this is the science of chaos theory. It was called chaos theory because it comes from the fact that systems that the theory describes and appear apparently disordered. So it seems like randomness, seems like it's total disorder. But when that theory is really about is finding the underlying order in these apparent random data. And you can Google chaos theory on your computer and you can look at these things, and there's the Mandelbrot set, which is fascinating, and then fractals, and it gets into all kinds of neat kind of science stuff. But the point is that there is sometimes a pattern, there is a pattern to what seems it's random in front of us. There's a greater pattern to what appears unpredictable to us. Now we think, the world thinks, as computers get more and more powerful and you start putting in more and more variables into this model, you'll be able to kind of define this stuff even more and more precisely. And this may be true. It seems to be true to a degree. We're better at modeling the weather now than we were back in the 60s. Some days not so good, especially in this part of the world, but it's better, right? Chaos and irregularity, unpredictability. Could it not be that these things are not just noise, but they actually have laws of their own, right? Some of the things that you apply this to is the beating of the human heart. It may seem slightly irregular, but there's a predictableness to it, thankfully. The human thoughts, there may be how they are going. If you look at electrical flows in human thoughts, it may seem chaotic, but it's not. There's a pattern to that. That's why you can think. Clouds and storms, the structure of galaxies follow these laws. The creation of a poem. The spread of, look at a tree. If you look at the trees outside here, individually, and one of those little leaves are just kind of fluttering randomly. But you look at the tree as a whole, it makes sense, does it not? The tree is a pattern, even though there's individual unpredictability with individual little things. You can go into genetics with this too, actually. There's a whole line of thinking. I've talked about maybe in the past. You have variants of unknown significance in your DNA. These are things that change who you are, but we don't really understand why they work. And I could go for an hour on that, but I won't go there now. But God himself, in this analogy, is the chaos, this order in this unpredictable thing. He is the order that we can't see, is he not? He is order. The confusion may seem to be a whirlwind or an earthquake or a fire. God is the deliverer, and he used plagues and floods and things that really were, without seeing the bigger picture, random, were they not? The wind itself is chaotic, silent, unpredictable, but a tornado is a highly organized process. The pillar of fire standing before Israel, as they were standing there on that Red Sea, seemed terrible and vast and powerful, and certainly was. The hurricane, it's all random, but we know it's coming. You can see the pictures of it now, right? As it moves across the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, you see the pattern. The flame of fire. It appears to randomly dance about. It's very pretty, lovely, look at all that sparkling, right? It's random, it's confusing, but it's chaotic. It has purpose and reason to it. It's just a chemical process. Where the fuel is, the fire goes. What type of fuel is fueling the fire is what type of fire you get processed. It's really fairly logical at the end of the day. These things that we have fear of, the wind, the fire, they can be confusing, but they need not be. Ecclesiastes 3. Solomon talked a little bit about these types of things a bit. To everything there is, verse 1 is, to everything there is a season, and to every time a purpose under the heaven. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up. These make a little bit more sense now, maybe. A time to weep and a time to laugh, a a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones, a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to get and a time to lose and a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to rend and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love, a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. What profiteth he that worketh and he that laboreth? I kind of kicked in the old King James there, right? So that last verse, what profit in your works pertain to or come from your labors? A commentary is Keelan Delich. It's an Old Testament commentary. Translates this actually, it's depending, everything has its time depending not on human influence, but on the determination and the providence of God. So no matter your work, your labor is a labor, your bigger part of that is the providence of God, is it not? All that man does is conditioned by the times, the change in the times and circumstances in relation to which he has no control, because God is in control. God is that order. So to chaos, seemingly unpredictable random events that we see in our lives, that we see in the world around us, these are not necessarily things to be feared. There may be factors that God has at play here, that he's working in maybe your life, maybe in the life of somebody else who needs it, to shape your life, to shape their life in the direction he wants it to go. Go back to Israel, right? With Israel standing there on the Red Sea before the army of Egypt, the mountains on the left, mountains on the right, they were afraid. They had fear and confusion in them. Exodus 14, verse 10, and when the Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them, and they were very afraid. And the children of Israel cried out to the Lord, and they said to Moses, because there are no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you so dealt with us to bring us out of Egypt? And the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward. I mean, think of God's patience at this point in time, or Christ's patience as he said those words in the tone. Why are you crying to me? Go forward, he's saying. Be not afraid, right? He says, don't be afraid. This is the ultimate expression of God's agape, is it not? This is God's unmerited expression of wanting to do what is best for you. Because you're afraid and you're cowering. But when you realize this, you don't need to be cowering, right? You have no fear when you realize this, that God's agape is there. That's all you need, because he's got what is best inside. You can't see what's going on. It's there. When we realize this, think of what God can do and accomplish within you. We don't have to worry about what is to come. There's that song, if our God is for us, then who can stand against us, right? Chris Tomlin, we probably know that song. It's a good song, and I don't want to sing it right now, but hum it to yourself, right? If our God is for us, then who could ever stop us, right? What did God tell Israel to do at there? He said, stand still. Prayer and meditation. Stand still. Listen to that still small voice. Stand up, square your shoulders, right? Gather the courage you need. Accept the burdens and the trials within yourself. Look around your life and look for the patterns in the chaos surrounding you. That order in the chaos. Bury your nose in the Word of God. right? Fear God and keep his commandments, as he says, Deuteronomy 13, verse 14. You shall walk after the Lord and fear him and keep his commandments and obey his voice, and you shall serve him and hold fast to him. He exhorts us to that. Walk after him on this path, on his will, seeking his will. Fear him, keep his commandments, and obey his voice. We need to recognize these patterns in our lives. We need to stand still, take a moment, and learn to listen and look for that chaotic order that's there. Follow his word and walk the path of his will. This is an act of faith, right? This is not easy. It's going to feel like you're confused. It's going to create maybe some fear in you if we choose to let it. Trust that God's plan is in motion and that it isn't necessarily one specific thing that you have in mind, but there can be a greater pattern seen from above. So, a couple applications of this a little bit to kind of think about and kind of noodle your brain on a little bit. We often try to create our own order, do we not? I got this figured out. I'm going to sort out the confusion. I'm going to sort out the unknown. Many of us probably make the mistake in our life that our life isn't ordered enough. It's less than perfect because we're not close enough to God in his ways, because we're not structured. We don't got it all in place, right? We haven't plugged in every hole. Most Christians in the world, most of us, look for peaceful, ordered lives, but we live in this world of confusion. Those are contrary things, is it not? So learn to look for the chaos and how God is working in that. It's not confusion, necessarily, if it's of him. We as Christians, we take this and we flee from anything that's unknown, right? I don't know what that is. No, right? I don't want to deal with that. I don't want to get it. We flee from change. We see change as dangerous and confusing. We don't see the chaos at work. We can't see it now, and sometimes you can't. That's the faith. You have to step forward. Try to do what is best for God. Looked at through his eyes, through time, through trials. It may not be directly in front of you, right? For we see in a mirror dimly, right? 1 Corinthians 13, verse 12. You may not fully see it, but it's there. And you see it in the systems of this world, right? There's progressive Babylonianism, right? It wants everything to be uniform and identical in this world, right? That's the bricks that built the Tower of Babel. Everything is ordered, predictable, set in place. And we are being worked and shaped by God in what seems like a random way into something that we can't see from our perspective, right? He is shaping us to be the rocks that are tried and worn and rubbed and ground to fit and to be those pieces of his altar, right? We are the stones of his altar that are going through all these random things that are not random. There's a greater plan. There's chaos. Fear. Fear leads to anger, right? Anger leads to hatred, and hatred leads to suffering. We've heard that phrase, as if you're a Star Wars geek. Fear of the unknown. Fear leads to confusion, and this leads to hatred. This leads to Satan. Confusion is of Satan. Seek the will of God. Find him in the chaos. There's a pattern there. You may not see it, nor in your view, because It may be happening, again, for the benefit of the other person. But there is a pattern. Going back to Elijah, right? Elijah was in that cave searching for answers. It wasn't in the wind. It wasn't in the earthquake. It was a still, small voice. And so it was when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle, and he went out and stood at the entrance to the cave. And suddenly a voice said to him, came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" God is a God of chaos, an order within the unknown. That is walking and finding his will. We have to trust, hope, have that peace that is there. Confusion is not chaos. Confusion is of Satan. God has a plan for us. He has a plan for us all. There's an order to all these things going on around us. In the end, we will see what we saw as confusion was actually chaos. So seek the will of God. Walk in chaos.